The reason why the Ukrainian people can't accept a ceasefire is there is zero confidence that Russia would ever abide by its word. It is worth any deal made with Russia the value of the paper it's written on. There is no confidence whatsoever that if you have a ceasefire today, it won't be broken in a year, 2 years, 3 years. Of course, I want to end the war. Signing a ceasefire doesn't end the war. It postpones it. Haven't we learned from history what it does to feed the beast of the fascist imperialist thugs? Their hunger doesn't get satiated with the eating, and they'll be back again. Hey folks, please like, comment, and subscribe, and make sure to check out my newsletter. Information is in the description. Obviously today there was an invitation to President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to come to the Oval Office and meet with Donald Trump, the current occupant of the Oval Office, and the leader of our country, allegedly. Trump has been, for weeks now, cutting Ukraine out of negotiations in the future of the conflict with Russia. As you guys, I'm sure, are aware, the country, known as the Russian Federation, invaded Ukraine. We're now approaching, if not have passed, the 3-year mark of that invasion, that attack against a sovereign country in Ukraine, the full assaults, the full invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine had been invaded prior, close to a decade prior, in the annexation of Crimea following the Euromaidan, the glorious revolution in which the Russian-aligned president had been overthrown by the people in response to some of his corruption and his decision to align himself closer to the fascist Russian state of Putin. The people didn't like that, threw his ass out, and in response, Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. Obviously, that generated a great deal of consternation in the world. In addition, Russia began funneling money and supporting Russian separatist groups in the eastern part of Ukraine. And essentially a hot conflict was already underway with this kind of deniable Russian separatists that essentially are proxies of the Russian state. Ukraine, in other words, has been suffering under the thumb of an invader, of a fascist threat, of an expansionist, imperialist state to its east for decades. The most recent conflict is but one of the latest dominoes of Russian involvement in the internal affairs of Ukraine. There have been a number of arrangements and deals over the years, supposedly to guarantee the independence of Ukraine, to make sure that this kind of thing wouldn't happen. There have been a number of instances of Russia flagrantly involving itself within the domestic affairs of Ukraine, whether that's attempted assassinations, political infiltration, and obviously outright espionage and now warfare. So this has been a long-standing issue for Europe, for the West, and for Russia, and of course the people of Ukraine, most importantly, who don't want to live under the yoke of Vladimir Putin. Let me repeat that. The Ukrainian people do not want to live under the thumb of a tyrant like Vladimir Putin. And who can blame them? Look at the immiseration of that society. Look at the level of corruption that someone like Putin has delivered to the Russian people now for years and years. And what freedom is worth to the Ukrainian people, what it means. What does it mean to you? What would it mean? What would you give up? What would you fight for? How long would you fight for? And on what conditions to defend your homeland? Both in the sense of your individual liberty, but also from an alien aggressor. We like to think of ourselves in America as, at least the Republicans, the MAGA type folks, as doing anything in our power to suppress the hostile invasion at the southern border. You remember that? At the start of the Trump administration, you saw all the slates of executive orders taken by Donald Trump to, for example, declare an emergency and say that America will stop at nothing to resist the foreign invaders, to resist the foreign occupiers, so they say. In our case, it's not an aggressive action by a hostile belligerent. It's a different kind of crisis. But imagine how Americans would react to, and we don't even have to imagine, we can look back at history at the kind of aggressive actions taken against this country in the past. Say, for example, Pearl Harbor. Say, for example, 9/11, the sinking of the Lusitania, unrestricted U-boat submarine warfare, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we took as an offensive action, the reaction that our country had to those kinds of escalations, we'll call them, from foreign belligerents. And now imagine what you would say to someone from your country or another country who says to you, hey, just give up, just surrender. So always keep in mind what's at stake for the Ukrainian people. It's their security, for sure. It's their independence, no doubt. It's their dignity, but it's also their freedom and their homeland. And think about what you would give up to defend that. For example, what would you give up if you were attacked? Let's put it in terms that the Republican right might understand, or the pro-Israeli right might understand. We said, in response to October 7th, never again. A hostile force crossing the border to kill, mutilate, that was seen as such an affront that, our support for Israel must be never ending. Map on the Russian context, the Ukrainian context. Make a comparison, actually. Think about it if you're on the Republican right. Why would you give, in this context, Zelensky less than your full help and assurances than you would give Netanyahu? This is, again, purely an internal critique to those who want to use the Israeli situation. Why is it that Trump is giving so much benefit to Israel and seems to be incredibly disdainful of Ukraine and not willing to give support to Ukraine? I think I know why. And I think it has to do not so much with geopolitics or strong negotiation tactics, but with corruption, with personal ambition, and with kinship with a dictator in Vladimir Putin. Some might say, well, is this war going to go on forever? Why doesn't Ukraine just accept a ceasefire? Let me be incredibly clear with every single one of you. Now, I'm not Ukrainian. I can't speak for the Ukrainian people. If I could guarantee that there would be no further invasion, encroachment into Ukraine, that the war would end and would not restart tomorrow, you gave in front of me, give everything that Russia has taken by force from Ukraine. They get to keep it. And they don't have to pay any reparations. Imagine that deal, right? So Russia gets everything they kept in conquest, and they don't have to pay anything. And in fact, Ukraine may never be in NATO. If you put that deal in front of me with the condition that I could guarantee that Russia would not encroach again and attack again, I'd sign it. Yes, I would. I would sign it. I can't speak for the Ukrainian people, but if I could have guarantees that the war would end and there would not be a further war to stop the bloodshed, I'd say yes. You can't look at me and say, hey, I just want this war to continue. The reason why the Ukrainian people, and really thinking insane people who are looking at the situation, can't accept a ceasefire is there is zero confidence that Russia would ever abide by its word. It is worth any deal made with Russia the value of the paper it's written on. What kind of a idiot would you have to be as a country to accept a quote unquote ceasefire for Russia to just reinvade in 2-3 years? Now, with their strength reacclimated, now that the sanctions have been lifted, they've had some time to recuperate, They've had some time to get more recruits and plan more meticulously their strategy. They've had some time to install into Ukraine more saboteurs to make sure that they don't f it up the same way that they did the start of the invasion in 2022. What kind of an idiot country would you have to be to accept a ceasefire under those terms just for them to invade in 3 years? There is no confidence whatsoever that if you have a ceasefire today, it won't be broken in a year, 2 years, 3 years. You would have to be a fool to sign on the dotted line and guarantee ceasefire on nebulous terms without any assurances. It's unacceptable. It would obviously be unacceptable to any thinking sane person. Can anyone make an argument for it? You trust Vladimir Putin? Truly. You trust Vladimir Putin a day after the ceasefire is signed? That's why this whole question of, don't you want to end the war? Of course I want to end the war. Of course Ukraine wants to end the war. Signing a ceasefire doesn't end the war. It postpones it. Haven't we learned from history? Haven't we learned from history what it does to feed the beast of the fascist imperialist thugs? Their hunger doesn't get satiated with the eating, and they'll be back again. You know, I talked to actual justice warrior, by the way, complete fool. He's on stage saying that Biden was tougher against Russia. Trump was tougher against Russia than Biden. Where's the redaction now? He seems oddly quiet, by the way. Actual justice warrior said, it's this foolish notion to have the Russian reset. On that, by the way, I'm kind of agreed. I think it was a foolish notion. I think Mitt Romney was right back in 2012. Maybe we have more information now to go on. But actual justice warrior said this. He said, this fanciful notion that we can have a Russian reset. Well, AJW, well, Sean, isn't that exactly what's happening right now? A failed attempt by the Trump administration. You call it, if you'd like, a Russian reset, but that assumes good faith. What's happening is Russian alignment. Okay? This is not a reset in opposition by mutually sort of self-sufficient countries or parties. It's Russian alignment. America is becoming in the Russian sphere of thought. It's a Russia-aligned country now. Our country, your republic, has been appropriated for the ends of Vladimir Putin. But AJW says it was a fanciful, stupid, naive thing to do, to reset relations with Russia and pretend that Putin's going to change. If it's so fanciful, if it's so crazy, which I agree it is, he's saying no more or less than what the Ukrainian people know, which is you do not trust a f***ing tiger, paper tiger or otherwise, in such a position. Yeah, sure. We'll do a ceasefire, a little bit like that ceasefire in Gaza. How long do you think that's going to last? When you have members of the ministry already signaling that they want to break it. And then if they don't break it, they'll tear down the government. No one has any faith that the ceasefire in Gaza will last. And if that's your position as a pro-Israeli, Republican, MAGA-aligned individual, let's say, assume for the sake of argument, as Trump is, right? Assume you're taking the positions of Trump in good faith. Why would you have any assurances of Vladimir Putin? The Ukrainian people have zero reason to believe his word. So we're emerging now in a situation where we are demanding of Ukraine something that would never be demanded of any other country that's been invaded like this, these kinds of concessions. And I even say, by the way, in a perfect world, Ukraine has to accept some concessions. Yes, even though they were violated. Yes, even though it's unfair. But I would only make that demand, which for many people would be way too far, right? That position, I don't know if my part of New York or my part of Texas were annexed by Mexico that I would ever want to give it up. So this is me from a detached perspective. Ukraine's not my home. So I just want to make that clear. I'm not sure that that's an even fair ask to give, but even me, who's willing to grant that, only if you could trust that you're not just going to get invaded tomorrow. It's the stupidest thing in the world. Imagine that you had this a contractor who's, repairing some part of your house for you. And he comes every day in the house, doesn't do any work. And he actually comes in your house and he steals jewelry, valuables. And he does a bunch of wrong things. And you say, I just want you out of the house. And he says, you just have to pay me a little bit more money. And I promise tomorrow, I'll actually do the work. And you're okay, here's $1,000. And he comes back and he keeps stealing things. And then he says, guys, don't you want to end? We're in this conflict, right? Like, don't you want to just end it? And let's just stop right now. Give me another $1,000, and tomorrow I'll never come back. And then he comes back the next day, and the next day, and the next day. So there's just no world, and even your personal life, when so many promises have been broken, when international law, to the extent that it's anything, the basic pillar foundation of the principles that undergird the United Nations and cooperation, international cooperation, is the respect of sovereignty. I thought that MAGA people would appreciate the importance of borders. How can that deal be imposed? And how can that deal be maintained? You're not thinking. You're not thinking about tomorrow because you're short-sighted. Just like all of those, by the way, CEOs and capitalists who voted for Trump. You're not thinking about tomorrow because you can only think in short time horizons. You can only think in your earnings for this quarter. You can only think about saying the words ceasefire and not about the state of the world as it's going to exist and as it will have to exist tomorrow. Think for a second in the long term, and also recognize and realize that Zelensky also has constraints. Zelensky, if he's just going to give the whole bag away to Russia or do so with an ethereal promise, he might get killed. His people might not accept it. Trump is working with constraints, so he says or claims. Putin claims he's working with constraints. So is Zelensky. We need to stop treating Ukraine as though it's just a plaything in the hands of the greater powers. It's this realism that doesn't have purchase with how people think and operate in the world. It's kind of a loose, disorganized bunch of context of things that are going through my mind. The importance for America's security in maintaining a strong front against Russia. Never forget that Russia interfered in our sovereignty, in our elections, that Russia has its eyes on other parts of Europe that are, including parts of NATO. Our security is implicated here. When Zelensky says as much, he's saying no more or less than what's obviously true. You don't like the Neville Chamberlain comparisons because they're so apt. You don't like the comparisons to other fascist expansionist states in the past, Mussolini, the imperial Japanese. You don't like those comparisons because they completely dismantle and give us lessons to guard against the nonsense of capitulation, ceasefire at any cost, and even if it's unmaintainable. It's kind of like when we decide not to give healthcare to individuals until they're at the emergency room. That's when the cost is at its highest. So it's not going to be until later on, then you start crying, and then you find out. And then you're sorry when the pain is at its highest. Right now, all the money that we're sending and should be sending to Ukraine, in a purely pragmatic calculus, a realpolitik calculus, is worth every penny in terms of the game of geostrategic interest and security of the United States. American lives are not being lost in that conflict. American businesses, we're paying for this stuff. We're paying someone to create weapons, or we're giving weapons as part of our stockpile. There's a benefit there. And by the way, there's a return benefit that we're getting from Ukrainians as well in terms of intelligence, in terms of an actual theater of war where we can see tactics, technologies that Ukrainians are giving us. And then the underlying moral obligation, I think, that if we have a willing, just partner defending against a fascist encroachment, America, as the leader of the free world, should rise to the occasion, should not be signing off on the position of Russia when there's just a condemnation of the wholesale invasion. America likes to pride itself as being the leader of the free world, the leader of the free world. You tell me, you in the chat, do you feel like the leader right now? Or do you feel like you're part of the Russian alliance. What do you feel like right now? Patriot in the chat. You feel like we're supporting freedom across the world? This isn't Iraq. This isn't in Afghanistan. This is not a conflict that America initiated or where there's an unwilling regime that we need to mold. These are Ukrainians extending out their hands and saying, help us achieve what you have. We're being attacked. We're being invaded. Help us. We want your help. We want to be like you. We want to rise to be like you. And before we get into this little conversation and also to some of the spinsters, let me say this. And I talked about this today with someone. Trump had such a squandered opportunity. Trump could have been one of the greatest presidents that America's ever seen. He has this magnetic energy that he's able to pull in so many people from his side and get them to believe in his message. He could have been a rallying force for freedom in the world in his first term. And even in his second term, the opportunity was there. The American people gave Trump a second chance. After everything he did. After everything that Trump did in the first term and in the interim, Americans said, we're going to give you a second chance. Do right by us. Do right by the American people. And Trump, who won't say a negative word about Vladimir Putin, squandered it. He's a demagogue. He is a tyrant in waiting, an authoritarian, a bully, and a decrepit piece of shit. And all the MAGA elite individuals, the thought leaders in MAGA, who support him and who make apologies for him and his policies, deserve your enmity forever. We are a laughingstock, a shame of the world, a nation in decline because of what this man has wrought. So let's talk about this press conference situation. Not really a press conference, it's a meet and greet and what the meeting is about. You know, Trump has, in trying to resolve the conflict in his terms, he says, been making approachments to Putin and to the Russian position. Being nice to the Russians, understanding to the Russians, showing a kinship with the Russians, and excluding the Ukrainians from the negotiations, not unlike his negotiation style with the Taliban. That didn't sit well with the world, or indeed Ukraine. Never forget, Ukraine is a party to this conflict, and Trump is excluding them. That's your negotiation strategy? You're hard with everyone, with Denmark, with Canada, with Panama, with Mexico, but not with Russia? We know why. You're a stooge of Russia, as has been proven time and time again. And there can be no lasting peace if you don't get the Ukrainians on board, so it's futile anyway. It's stupid. And rather than pressure Putin, as you would think would be the logical thing to do in a negotiation, you're undercutting supposedly your own ally, Ukraine, and saying how unfair Ukraine has treated America, demanding of Ukraine extractions and concessions in terms of resources. Give us all of this as back pay for what we did in the past. So maximal pressure on Ukraine saying, hey, we want these minerals for our robber baron friends as back pay because of how you fucked us. That's their narrative of it. And Zelensky, the true version of Trump, this is a media guy, an actor who rose to a position of political prominence, an outsider. He's a leader of his people. Does he say under no circumstances are we going to make a deal? No. He's being pressured upon by supposedly his friend in America, but he in good faith sends a delegation, including himself, to hash out a deal for minerals, for America's benefit. Forgetting, of course, the obvious benefit we're getting geostrategically in terms of intelligence, in terms of our own security, in terms of helping our own industries. Forgetting all that, we want more. But Zelensky is a reasonable man, willing to have a negotiation with Trump. And they actually hash out a deal. That's what he's here for. To sign a deal. Minerals for aid. Quid pro quo. Doesn't help that in the interim, Trump is constantly lying about Ukraine, about how much aid America has given, about how much aid Europe has given, about how much of the aid Europe has given is a loan versus not a loan, about whose fault the invasion is, calling Zelensky a dictator for following his constitution. What, you want him to ignore his constitution? Not everyone is like Trump and Trump supporters. They demand of their leaders lawlessness. They demand that their leaders be above the constitutions of their respective countries. Saying Putin's a swell guy, expressing gratitude and love, admiration for Putin. All that's going on as, call that the backdrop of what's going on here. And this true leader of his people, Zelensky, not like the oaf, the disgusting degenerate we have in our Oval Office, is ignoring the insults to the dignity of the Ukrainian people, ignoring the attacks and assaults on the truth, and saying, we'll go to Washington and we'll hash this out because we've been attacked. Right? Trump says, why did you start the war to Ukraine? Ukraine who was attacked. Why did you start this war? Why was your family member murdered? Imagine, by the way, think about how the Republicans treat the Laken Riley incident. Someone comes up to Laken Riley's parents and says, why did she provoke this attack? That by itself, disgraceful, disgusting, a degenerate mind, filthy, scarcely human, this guy. So they have this Washington sit down and they're talking. Trump and Vance are lying the entire time. Mostly Trump. Vance isn't as chatty in the first part of it. Lying their ass off. Talking about how Putin and him were both over by the Russia narrative. By the way, anyone who says Russia narrative to you is a known liar. Anyone who says, I don't really know about this whole Russia investigation thing, you can discount everything they say. Anyone who brings up, all the Russia collusion stuff, you can discount them. They don't know the facts. They're not giving you the facts. They're trying to distort your mind. They're trying to obscure the fact that this man, if he's not in hoc to Russia, if he's not indebted to Russia, if he's not controlled by Russia, he is aligned with Russia. They're trying to downplay that significance. This guy's a stooge. He's a Russian stooge, 100%. And anyone who tells you otherwise, they're lying to you. He loves Putin. He loves dictators. He's an evil guy. We have a guy who wants to be a dictator, wants to be a king in charge of our country right now. And so he's airing these grievances in front of the president of Ukraine. Where's the diplomacy there? By the way, we'll get to the spinsters in a second, but there's going to be a point of contention that I bring up, is everyone's talking about Zelensky. Where's Zelensky's his good sense to just let these mongrels lie and demean his country? Where's Trump's good sense? Unable to control his urges like a child, unable to control his grievances for 1 second, talking about Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden. Elections are over and they can't let go. They're in charge now, and it's excuse after excuse. Promise after promise. We'll end the war in 1 day. Prices will come down day one. IVF will be free. It'll be big. It'll be beautiful. We'll release the Epstein files in their entirety. It's excuse after excuse. Grievance after grievance. These f***ing snowflakes can't handle 1 ounce of pushback. That's true of the leaders. The press pool is now infected by agents of MAGA. The press pool is now part of the administration, to the great shame of our country, asking sycophantic questions. Sir, isn't it true that your dick is made of solid gold and it's 12 inches long? Sir, isn't it true that you're Jesus Christ come again? The biggest whiners, the biggest pussies that have ever lived. And everyone, by the way, who's part of that influencer class, same exact shit. They talk about, we love the tough conversation. Theo Vaughn, Dave Portnoy, all these douchebags don't know shit. They couldn't have a tough conversation for 1 second without crying. And Trump is no different. And so after being lied about, and we can go through it if you want to seriously contest it, these depraved guys start talking about, hey, we know this kind of tough talk doesn't work because that's what we had under Joe Biden. This is JD Vance talking. And look, he invaded your country in that time frame. What's the implication there, by the way? Why does Zelensky speak up at that exact point? The implication, number one, is they weren't already invaded before. The president of Ukraine is gonna correct your dumbass when you're getting the timeline of the invasion wrong. He's not going to just sit there like a potted plant and say, yeah, you're right. Invasion happened under Joe Biden's watch. That's when all the badness started. This is a problem extending back in the past. And the encroachment, the physical military encroachment on Ukraine started years before, under Obama and throughout Trump's tenure. And it's vitally important for Zelensky not to be a bitch and say, yeah, it's all Biden's fault, because that's not true. And yeah, you have a good point, JD Vance. You Yaley. Your dick is also 12 inches and you have a mighty fine penis, sir. It's important for him to say, listen, this is not about an incompetence in America. This is about a rapacious, expansionist Russian Federation that wants to invade other countries and has on other opportunities and has interfered in the sovereignty of its neighbors constantly. That needs to be made clear. And it is totally appropriate. Zelensky, who's here on his own initiative as well, it's not just the America show. These things aren't just for Americans to say, hey, listen, Russia, we have to acknowledge that Russia has encroached on us for many presidential terms. This has been a long-standing thing. And JD Vance and Trump can't handle it. A completely respectful thing to say, a necessary thing to say, a good thing to say, not at all in a tone of disrespect, not at all in a tone of demeaning JD Vance, who deserves to be demeaned, Trump, who deserves to be demeaned. Both of them deserve to be impeached. Trump deserves to rot in jail for the rest of his life. In a respectful manner, he says, sir, Russia, we know, as an ESL, by the way, too, English or third, fourth, fifth language, this problem has been long-standing, and they can't handle it. Throwing a tantrum in the Oval Office, they're upset that they can't keep their promises, that the American people are seeing through their garbage, and the war on day one. If you believe them, you're a fool. And if you're covering for them still, as they try to justify their little outburst, their tantrum, aligning with Putin, where are your loyalties? Your loyalties are to one man or I should say two men, Donald Trump and the person he's in hock to, Vladimir Putin. So you've seen the video. I mean, I can go through it, but as I sit here more and more, it's a little difficult to stomach what you just saw. And the reason it's so visceral is because America's supposed to be in contradiction to tyranny. For years in the Cold War, we fought against Soviet and Russian style infiltration. And it seems that their narrative has reached the highest office in the land. Their positioning, their interests, their wants, and their desires has had an effect, and their policies are now being implemented by the regime. And there's no bigger, stark signal than to see those decrepit and degenerates sitting next to a real leader like babies, unable to handle even just a word of, hey, Russia. Think about how inoffensive this is. Russia invaded us. They did it for a while under many presidents. They can't handle that. And they say, you should be thanking us. You should be on our knees like a dog. You'll find the Ukrainian people aren't going to be spoken to in that tone. And no one should be licking your feet, JD Vance or Donald Trump. You guys aren't fit to lick the streets of New York City. You guys are worth nothing more than a fleck of human feces. You stain and dishonor the Oval Office every second you draw breath there. In any just society, you would have been out on the street the minute you set foot in office, and everyone realized how much of a incompetent and frankly corrupt and conflicted administration you're presiding over. You are no one to make those kinds of demands of servility, especially not when the Ukrainians have fought valiantly on our behalf for our interests, as I said, national security wise, geostrategically, and in our image. Never forget what America is and was. America is, as our former president, Joe Biden, used to say, it's an idea as well as a place where we overthrew a tyrant. And in defending themselves against the Russian fascist invader, the Ukrainians are upholding American values more than the sitting commander-in-chief and JD Vance ever could. It is a shame. It is a disgusting display in our Oval Office, and you guys are right to be angry. You should be angry. You should be suspicious. You should be disgruntled, agitated. This should piss you off. And it should piss you off that your elected officials, if they're Republican, will start, are praising Trump as a statesman. Where is the requirement for Trump to act like a statesman, actually? Where is the nuanced critique, even from a MAGA person who doesn't want to fund Ukraine? If you're for peace, maybe you shouldn't have flown off the handle. Maybe Ukrainians need to be on board too, and this isn't the best idea. Maybe I want some decorum of my officials. So your Republican officials are just as scumbaggy, just as degenerate as the two elected officials you saw there. Marco Rubio slinking down like a worm. Lindsey Graham, John McCain rolling in his grave. Spineless coward, hated by everyone, by the way, Lindsey Graham. Even the MAGA haters in the chat will agree with that. Spineless coward. How about them Democrats, though, huh? 99 votes for Marco Rubio? Anyone want to repudiate their vote? Anyone want to say that was a mistake? Anyone want to call for Marco Rubio to resign, in fact? For Trump to resign? For JD Vance to resign? How about your Democrats continuing to vote for Trump nominees? Pete Hegseth in his little outfits. If this doesn't wake up the Democrats that they need to start having a little bit of nerve, I don't know what will. It's full opposition. It's full resistance. Anything less than that is a disgrace. And if John Fetterman and other people like him don't want to get on board, primary their ass. I am so sick and tired of weak, spineless Democrats unable to speak truth to power and to call out this degeneracy. I'm so sick of our Constitution being trampled on, our allies being put last, and the interests of Vladimir Putin being put first. And now let's talk about the influencers. The influencers. Cenk Uygur. MAGA News Cenk Uygur starts off by saying, hey, Zelensky started it. Anyone who gives you the take Zelensky started it, they also deserve your distrust. That demonstrates to you that they don't have a grip on reality. Like, it's not even in contradiction to Zelensky, to JD Vance necessarily, and just saying, hey, this thing has a deeper cause than Joe Biden's incompetence. Just to be clear, like where Ukraine stands, that is no excuse for anyone to fly off the handle. But if I can't reach your heart, let me reach your head. Put aside everything I said on my pedestal about American values, about the degeneracy of Trump. Put aside everything I said about fighting for liberty. Put aside all of that. And just think, if you want peace and ceasefire tomorrow, don't you need security guarantees for Ukraine to accept them? If you want tomorrow for this war to be as soon as possible, don't you need Ukraine on board? If you want to fulfill your promise, doesn't it make sense to bolster your ally at least a little and not fly off the handle at the bare minimal statement that you don't like? As just a practical matter, all you've done now is invigorate, in some ways, the EU support of Ukraine. They're now more encouraged than ever to provide continuing lethal assistance to Zelensky. That's maybe a corollary benefit. It doesn't outweigh the harm, I think, done by America sort of giving up their position both morally and financially. But it does potentially forebode, in your mind, the continuation of armed struggle. So if you're just purely rational, trying to end start a ceasefire on your own terms, to end the conflict on the lines currently drawn out in Russia's favor, assume that that's your interest, why would you take this approach of being a complete dickhead in the Oval Office, Trump and Vance, and of not even considering security guarantees? Here's where the problem is, though. Raising security guarantees is so prejudicial and problematic for the Trump-aligned Republicans to do because they know Putin can't accept them because Putin wants to take over. That's where the irreconcilable differences are, right? It's this pretense that we have to all sit and think, yeah, Putin's this kind of, he's an interlocutor. He's doing no more than just kind of extending his sphere of influence because NATO was expanding. Complete bullshit. And what he wants really are just to freeze the battle lines. He's a reasonable guy. No, he wants to take over. And so, of course, they can't bring up security guarantees because that's irreconcilable with Putin's desires. So that's why we are at an impasse. Is at a certain point in every negotiation, there are hard lines. And Ukraine's hard line is sovereignty. And Russia's hard line is lack of Ukrainian sovereignty. And that's where we're at. And you have to ask yourself, really, these people who say that they're in favor of ceasefire right now, if you were to ask them currently, okay, let's say that Russia breaks the ceasefire and does another invasion, what then? What's the plan then? And the truth is they have no response to that. Because they can't say at that point, okay, then it's all no holds barred. Then we really just can't be letting Russia take over. Like at that point, after this agreement, if they break this agreement, then we really have to give in all the assistance. And that's just a line that they can't cross. They can't do that because that's the situation we're in right now. And so the answer is, if this ceasefire gets broken again in the future and Russia invades once more, you let them take over. That's where we're at. That's the irreconcilable nature of what's happening. And that's why Trump has stabbed Ukraine in the back. It's because he's a Russian stooge, and because as between those two situations, Russian sovereignty over Ukrainian land and Ukrainian sovereignty over Ukrainian land, Trump prefers the former. Trump prefers Russia to take over Ukraine. And as long as that's the case, these conflicts will become intractable and these outbursts will become inevitable.